in the CERD review. The CERD is the short form we use for the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We have over 120 people registered for the webinar. I know that people will be logging on as we start speaking, so hopefully other people, we won't be notified when people register, and so it should just be seamless, and they'll join along when they sign up. We're very excited to have the lineup of speakers that we have today, and I'll be doing a short introduction later on. But before we start, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping details. The first is that we have this session in listen-only mode. That essentially means that all the participants are muted, and the only people who are unmuted at the moment are the presenters. When we get to the question and answer session, we will change the settings so that people can unmute themselves, and we'll give you instructions for how to do that when we get to that session. This is a new webinar system that we're using, and we've had, the last time we used the webinar, some people had their PowerPoint stuck on a particular page. You just need to refresh your page or to close out and log back in to the session, and that will typically get you back onto the same page as the rest of us. And then this is kind of late to make this announcement, but just so that people know as well, there is a webcam option that is available to people that we're asking people not to use. Otherwise, we'll all watch you as you listen in. So back to the webinar. Like I mentioned, we're thrilled to have the speakers that we have today. And we have Gabriella Habtom, who is calling in from Geneva, Switzerland, and at a late hour, not very late, but at a late hour. So we're excited to have her, and she's with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN. We have Amy Berquist, who's with closer to home, and with the Advocates for Human Rights, and helped us put together a fabulous 10-step guide to writing a shadow report, and we'll be going over that with Farah Tanis, who is here in New York, and with the Black Women's Blueprint. And so she and Amy will be going over the concrete steps. And then we have Salima Hankins, who is the CERD Task Force Coordinator, who will also be presenting towards the end. And we really are hoping that this is a webinar that will jumpstart people, if you haven't already started, in drafting your shadow reports and then thinking more concretely about how you engage effectively in using the CERD review that's coming up. Salima, could you change the slide? Okay. So, the U.S. Human Rights Network. So for those of you who don't know, we are partnering with the speakers we mentioned today, and the U.S. Human Rights Network is a national network of organizations and individuals who've come together to try to grow and strengthen a human rights movement and culture in the United States. And we are particularly invested in building a people-centered movement, one that is led by people who are most directly impacted by human rights violations. We celebrated our 10th anniversary last December, and we have been growing and expect to be growing more, not just as a network, but even more importantly, as a movement. So could we switch? All right, so our agenda for today. Now, we scheduled 2 hours for this webinar, but we think we can get through it in an hour and a half. So that's what we're shooting for. We're going to start off with just a basic introduction to what is CERD and why is it important. What do you need to know to engage in the process? Then, as I mentioned, concrete steps to writing a shadow report. Then we'll really end the presentation portion by talking about our process, how groups can engage in the process. And then open it up for question and answer and be sharing some of the resources that we have available with you. So next slide. Okay. What is CERD and why is it important? Let's go to the next slide. Of course, my own slide is frozen, so, but yes, we want to start with the slide that says Human Rights Treaties ratified by the U.S. Okay, perfect. Could you go? Yes, wonderful. So I just wanted to start with an overview of the treaties that the United States has ratified. And we're starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not a treaty per se, but is recognized as international customary law and has been signed by the United States. And so all the rights protected in it, including economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights, are all rights that apply to all human beings and that we try to hold the U.S. government accountable to. And the U.S. has also ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The U.S. has ratified the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment and Punishment. We generally call that CAT. And then, of course, the treaty we're talking about today, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So we'll typically refer to this as ICERD, or more commonly CERD. And sometimes we've been trying, especially in a lot of the outreach we do beyond the legal human rights community, we talk about it as the race treaty. So this is a very unique year that we have coming up. And I don't know when we're going to see this again. For all the 3 treaties that the United States has ratified, the U.S. government will be reviewed on them in 2014. So we just completed the review for the ICCPR on civil and political rights, which happened in March. We are here to discuss the upcoming review on compliance with the race treaty, CERD, which is happening in August. And then in September, we have reports due for a different process called the Universal Periodic Review, which we will be having webinars on as well. Then in November, we have the review on the U.S. government's compliance with CAT, the Convention Against Torture. And then next year in April and May, the U.S. will undergo the Universal Periodic Review, which, as I mentioned, is a slightly different process than the treaty reviews. So we have a busy year. And what we are trying to do is to make sure that we leverage all these treaty reviews effectively and maximize the opportunity so that we build a robust human rights agenda in the U.S. and really do effective human rights organizing, leveraging these treaty reviews. So now, the CERD process. As I mentioned, CERD, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, was ratified, is one of the ratified treaties, and it was ratified by the U.S. Senate in 1994. The U.S. government signed it in 1965, but ratified it in 1994. Now, like most treaties, CERD has also created a body of independent experts to monitor the implementation of the treaty by countries that have ratified it. So this is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. For our purposes, we'll be calling it the committee here. And so when a country ratifies a treaty, they're required to submit regular reports to the Committee of Independent Experts detailing how they are complying with the treaty. And so the U.S., every government that ratifies a treaty is required to do this, and the U.S. government submitted its third report in June of 2013. Now, could we go to the next slide? Perfect. So when governments submit their reports to the committee also invites civil society, in other words, people like us, advocates, organizers, activists, to submit alternative reports, which are also called shadow reports. And essentially, they know that no government is going to give all the information necessary on how it's really complying with the treaty. So they depend on groups like us to supplement the information or correct the information that is in the government reports and give the on-the-ground information. So that's what we're going to be going through today in terms of a step, how you draft an effective shadow report, as well as engage in the CERD review process. The suggested date for submitting shadow reports on the U.S. CERD review is June 30th. So basically less than 4 weeks at the end of this month. And in addition to submitting shadow reports, there are many other ways to engage in the process. One of them is having an opportunity to brief the committee members in person. Now, this generally happens in Geneva. However, we'll be talking about our process later, so we're trying to create opportunities so that even people who don't go to Geneva will have an opportunity to influence that process as well. Now, based on the information that the U.S. government submits and that we, as racial justice advocates and human rights advocates, submit, the committee will then conduct an in-person review. And that's the review we've been talking about that will take place this August 13th and 14th, at the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. Now, a few other things about the process is that after the review, and this will happen probably at the end of August, the committee issues what are its recommendations for how the U.S. can better comply with the race treaty, and those are called concluding observations. And to be perfectly frank, this is really the meat of the work, because this is where we need as groups to really push for implementation of those concluding observations, but it's also the most difficult part of the work. And so we are doing a number of things, and we will be talking about that, but one is that we've been demanding that the Obama administration adopt a national plan of action for racial justice, which will detail how it intends to fully implement CERD. And groups can participate in that process. And there are also, the administration has created an interagency working group called the Equality Working Group that is supposed to help oversee concrete implementation steps on the U.S. government side. So we'll be pushing and working with that group. And then in addition to all this, a year after the review, the committee will, or during the review, the committee will select a few key issues that they want a report back on within a year. And so we'll be also working to make sure that the key issues are included. Those key issues are selected for the concluding observations, and that we push to get them implemented as well. And then I want to end on this, and this is really just talking about why CERD, because often people ask the question, well, we have all these strong civil rights laws, So why do we need additional human rights law on addressing racial discrimination? Well, the truth is that while we do have a robust civil rights regime in this country, one, it's been weakened by Supreme Court decisions over the last 2 decades. But the other thing is that the civil rights law we have today was really created to address more overt forms of discrimination, Jim Crow era discrimination. Today we find that discrimination happens in more indirect ways, structural forms of discrimination and racism. And we don't really have laws to address these contemporary forms of discrimination, and that's really what CERD does. So, for example, CERD looks at policies and practices that not only have the intent of discriminating against a group of people based on their race, but also policies and practices that have the effect, the impact of discriminating. And we often see that impact in race disparities. CERD goes beyond viewing race policies that result in these negative race disparities as discrimination. It requires governments to affirmatively address race disparities. So that's also an addition that we don't have in current civil rights law, except in the narrow area of housing, or a narrow area of housing, I should say. So it also recognizes the interdependence of race and gender, so it doesn't force you to choose what identity or what aspect of your identity you were discriminated against based on. It understands that as people with complex identities, including race and gender, those identities can interact to form our experience in the world, including how we experience discrimination, and that men and women don't experience racial discrimination, don't always experience racial discrimination in the same ways. And then finally, CERD also recommends that countries have a national plan of action, or the committee has recommended that countries have a national plan of action to implement CERD, and that it has a central agency or commission to educate the public and monitor CERD compliance. And that's also something that we don't have. Even though we have a U.S. Civil Rights Commission, their mandate does not currently cover CERD, so we are also pushing. That could be one of the things that we push for. And so I will end there on the CERD overview, and now turn over to Gabriella Habtom, who is the secretary for the committee and is with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we're so thankful that she was able to join us from Geneva to share some thoughts on what we as civil society need to know to effectively engage in the CERD process. Gabriella?
Thank you, Ajin. Good morning to all of you. Well, it's late afternoon here, getting a little bit darker actually, starting to. First of all, I would like to thank Ajin and particularly the U.S. Human Rights Network for inviting me to this webinar. I must admit this is my first webinar. As you're preparing to engage with the committee at its upcoming session in Geneva when the periodic report of the USA will be considered. As you know, and as Ajim also mentioned in her presentation, the committee, CERD, attaches great importance to the work carried out by civil society organizations at local, national level in advancing the cause of ICERD. Therefore, I believe it is very important that you will be able to share the wealth of knowledge that you have on the issues on the ground with the committee. The question is how to do this effectively. Well, you can engage with the committee prior to the session by submitting written information, and during the session by attending the informal meeting with the NGOs, by engaging directly with members of the committees. We will, when you are in Geneva, you will also be able to observe the interactive dialogue between the committee and the government delegations. And I must say, for those that, for different reasons, may not be able to join, to come to Geneva, for the last few years, the public sessions of treaty bodies in general and CERD in particular have been webcasted. Therefore, you will be able to follow the constructive dialogue between the committee and the government delegation online. So, going back to your engagement in terms of written submissions. I think that if I have a humble advice in that regard, is that your alternative reports be as brief and as concise as possible, obviously relevant to ICERD, and preferably if you could also include an executive summary, that would be really great. Committee members normally look for specific, reliable, and objective information, which enables them to assess the status of implementation of the provision of ICERD on the ground. The experience that we have on this side when we have big and complex countries, such as US, is that you have a lot of information, a great deal of participation, which is most welcome, but the challenge is how to really channel that wealth of information in an effective manner. And here comes again the issue of coordination. Really, I will not stop highlighting this element, coordination, enough, because it's really crucial. You have to consider avoiding duplications, which I believe also responds to a more effective use of resources by civil society organizations, which already do not have much financial resources normally. And when possible in this regard, we would really advise for joint submissions. This have, in a number of examples, have always worked really well for the committee. Last but not least, I think very important is that the written information reach the committee in advance of the session so that they have enough time to read and prepare. Normally, the deadline for submission of reports is 2 weeks before the session, but in cases of big and complex countries, the earlier the better. So if we're able to receive your submissions by the end of June, that would be really great, because then the members can have enough time to go through them, to get prepared before they come to Geneva. You also have to consider that the committee has a quite a busy schedule with 7 countries on their agenda. Therefore, the amount of information they receive is really huge. And in this regard, once again, the earlier you submitting your written submission, the better. As Agent mentioned in her introduction, in addition to the written information, there are other opportunities of engaging with the committee, such as having an informal, participating at the informal meeting during the session. And once more, I have to stress the importance of coordination, and that the oral presentations should be really brief and to the point, for you to allow time for more questions and answer sessions with the committee, so you can really engage with the committee in an effective way. And of course, after the end of the session, once you have the concluding observations, there is a follow-up procedure. It's another opportunity where you can engage by submitting information on those 2 or 3 issues that the committee will be selecting, and requesting the USA to report back in 1 year time. So to conclude, I really think you need to be really three crucial elements: to be focused, to be concise, and coordinated in order to really effectively engage the CERD process. And I think the U.S. Human Rights Network really provides an excellent platform for this. Obviously, NGOs can submit information to the committee directly, but the committee has always encouraged and has requested the Secretariat to encourage coordinated, when possible, joint submissions, and of course, again, focused and concise. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to seeing you all, or at least most of you, in Geneva. I know quite a high number of civil society organizations will be represented in Geneva. It seems to be that's the trend when the U.S. comes to be considered, and we are all excited. We're looking forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. That was very helpful, we really appreciate you again calling in from Geneva to give us this important information. And we'll be carrying the message forward about being focused, concise, and coordinated. Unfortunately, Gabriella will not be able to stay through the full webinar for the Q&A, but we will be taking questions, and if there are any questions that are directed to her, we will make sure she gets them and get a response back to you if we don't already have the answers to that question. So thank you, Gabriella. And so we will now be moving on to how you write a shadow report, like concrete steps to writing an effective shadow report. And for this portion, we have Amy Berquist and Farah Tanis.
Thank you, Ajim. This is Amy Berquist here. Farah, are you there?
I am here. Thank you, Ajim. How are you?
Thank
you. Good to be here.
Great. Well, I think we can advance to slide 1 to give the overview of this part of the presentation. Oh, I guess we didn't have an overview. That's fine. So we're going to go through 10 steps to writing a shadow report, and I want to make it clear to everyone who's listening in that anyone can do this. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to have prior experience with the United Nations. And Farah, can you confirm, have you ever done anything with the United Nations before, ever written a shadow report?
We have not written a shadow report, so this is definitely our first time doing it, and so we're very excited.
And it's really, it is something that's meant to be accessible. As you heard from Gabriella, they are looking to all of you as experts on what's happening on the ground. And so a shadow report is really a way for all of you who are listening to take your expertise, what you know about what's happening with respect to human rights in the United States, and provide that information to the experts who serve on the committee. So don't be intimidated. Anyone can do this, and Farah and I will show you exactly how Farah is thinking about going through these steps for a shadow report from the Black Women's Blueprint. So Farah, let's start out with step 1, which is identifying your expertise. Tell us a little bit about you and the Black Women's Blueprint and how that fits in with what you might do with a shadow report.
Absolutely. Thank you. So my name, again, is Farah Tanis. I am one of the co-founders and executive director of Black Women's Blueprint. We're a national organization, and we're working specifically in African-American communities and on historically Black colleges and universities across the nation to prevent sexual assault. And our work specifically highlights the violations of the right to bodily security for women of color. Great.
And as you did you have more to say? I didn't mean to interrupt you, Farah.
Well, and some of our advocacy goals, I can talk about, as we continue, or I can talk about it now.
Sure. Well, I think I think there's another step where we get into a little bit more depth there about your advocacy goals. So we'll talk about it then. And do you have resources? Do you have people who can help with writing the shadow report?
We do. We have a number of we're using a multidisciplinary approach. Now we're working primarily with survivors, as their voices really are at the center of this. So survivors of sexual assault and other forms of violence along the spectrum of gender violence. We are also working with folks with research experience who are also very much steeped in communities of color and very much steeped in the work. We're using community-based organizations with whom we've partnered with for a very long time and who also do the work nationally and who could provide other lenses that we may not have the strength to provide on our own as an organization.
Great. And the important takeaway for everyone is you don't have to do this all by yourself. So it's not going to be Farah alone who's writing this report. She's going to draw on other individuals to help support her work, and that's an important part of the first step, is that you're not alone. Find other people who can help you out. And I think that's a good segue to step 2, which is identifying allies. So let's take a look there. So are there any organizations that you're going to tap, Farah, to assist or to sign on or to collaborate? I know we just heard from Gabriella the importance of working in coalitions and doing joint submissions. So what do you have in mind there?
Absolutely. I think, one of our greatest allies, is right here, the U.S. Human Rights Network. But in terms of writing our shadow report, the National Organization of Sisters of Color, Working to End Sexual Assault, which is a national organization, the Black Women's Roundtable, which focuses on some of the impacts of sexual violence and has a lot of just connections politically and in Washington, D.C., as far as looking at policies and some policy analysis. The Women of Color Network, the University of Minnesota and their research arm through the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American community. And so these are some of our allies in this work who can really help us present not only a concise but a concise and comprehensive, we've got to figure out how to make that happen, report to the committee.
Yeah, and that's fantastic that you've already identified those organizations, and those sound like they're great allies to collaborate. And another thing you might want to do is find out, is anyone else already planning to do a report on issues related to your issues of interest? And so it might make sense for you to draft one section that would be folded into a larger report, for example. Depending on what your issue areas are, that might be another way to collaborate, is if there are interrelated, intersectional issues on a particular overarching topic, each organization could draft a particular section, and then it would all be packaged together in one place for the committee members. So that sounds great. All right, well, let's take a look at step 3, and this is where you have to do a little bit of homework, and it's identifying the rights. Now, the committee experts are experts on what the treaty actually says, what the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, what that language says and means. So all of you writing shadow reports, you don't have to be an expert in what that treaty language means, but you do need to create a bridge for the committee members between their expertise, which is all about what the treaty is, and what's happening on the ground. And that bridge is really identifying the relevant articles in the convention that are relevant to your issues and your work. So, Farah, have you had a chance to take a look at the convention to see if there are any articles that touch on or relate to your key issue areas?
Absolutely. In looking at it, Article 2, which is Article 1, Article 2, which is mentioned here, and which prohibit racial discrimination in all its forms. Article 5, Section A and B, and Article 6 also apply here, which speak to the right to equal treatment before tribunals and all other organs administering justice, and that is for survivors seeking justice after sexual assault and really looking at discriminatory practices and eliminating those and protecting victims from discrimination in the legal justice system. The right to security of person and protection by the state against violence or bodily harm, obviously, is Part B. And then C, state parties shall assure to everyone within their jurisdiction effective protection and remedies. So those are the articles and sections of the articles that we're looking at in terms of our advocacy and the work that we're doing. We're framing it within those.
That's great. And another thing you can do to help the committee members, sort of as a form of extra credit, it's certainly not required, but the committee also issues what they call general recommendations, where they issue a document that gives their own committee's official interpretation of what certain articles in the convention mean. And you'll see up on the screen, the second bullet point is a quotation from General Recommendation 25, which might be relevant to your work, Farah, and you might want to reference this, at least briefly, in your shadow report, is the issue of racial discrimination affecting women and men differently. And so that's something you might want to take a little bit of a closer look at what the committee has said in General Recommendation 25 about the gender differences, how men and women experience racial discrimination differently. And that sounds like that might be of particular relevance to the work that the Black Women's Blueprint is planning to do with this shadow report.
Absolutely. A review of the CERD Committee's concluding observations and also the ICCPR is what we're focusing on right now to really pull out all of what we'll need. And there are specific recommendations that we've looked at that we can talk about later on.
Yeah, great. So now we'll step ahead to review. We already heard from AGEM where we are in the process and what the process is. And so in step 4, what you'll want to do is take a look at what's happened so far as it relates to the rights that you've identified that relate to your issues. And so first you'll go back to 2008 and look at the concluding observations from the last time the CERD Committee reviewed the United States. You'll take a look at those concluding observations to see if they said anything that possibly relates to your issues. Did you get a chance to do that, Farah? Did you look through those concluding observations from 2008?
Absolutely, and we did find some very specific recommendations. In general, really, more education and training to address the lack of education and training in communities about CERD, about the particular articles pertaining to the rights of women and the protection of women, but specifically what the observations, the concluding observations, there were 4 or 5 recommendations specifically, setting up and adequately funding prevention and early assistance centers, counseling services, and temporary shelters for women and other persons who are victims of violence, providing specific training for those working within the criminal justice system, including police officers, lawyers, prosecutors, and judges, and medical personnel, really undertaking information campaigns to raise awareness among women belonging to racial, ethnic, and national minorities about the mechanisms and procedures provided for national legislation, like VAWA, for example, like the Clery Act, for example, like the Campus Save component of the VAWA that was just passed on the issue of racism and discrimination as it relates and intersects with gender, and also ensuring that reports of rape and sexual assault against women belonging to racial, ethnic, and national minorities, and in particular, as we've talked about in previous meetings, Native American women are independently, promptly, and thoroughly investigated, and that harm doers, as we call them, although in the recommendations it says perpetrators are prosecuted and appropriately punished. Although we are making different recommendations ourselves that we'd like to see around the intersection of prosecution and the criminal justice system and racism and how that impacts the entire community. So there are some complications there that as we prepare our report that we would like to present, just the impact of criminal justice, how that systemic form of racism against an entire community under siege really impacts the ability of the community and the ability of survivors to seek justice.
That's great. It sounds like there's a lot for you to work with from the 2008 concluding observations, and I like that you took a critical eye to it. That you don't necessarily think that the concluding observations from 2008 were perfect, and you might want to see a different outcome from this 2014 review, and that's good to keep in your mind to say, okay, this is what they said last time. We think the language could be better. We think they could have a different focus. That's fantastic. So you want to take a look at that, and these concluding observations, as AGEM said, they're the real meat of the review. This is the real outcome of the review, but they're not supposed to just go on a shelf and gather dust. What the U.S. government was supposed to be doing, and civil society was supposed to be helping the U.S. government with this, is implementing those observations, those recommendations from 2008. So that's supposed to have been what's been happening for the past 6 years. And we should be seeing in the U.S. government report some evidence that they took steps to implement those recommendations from 2008. And they're also, in the U.S. government report, supposed to say where things are now with respect to the rights that are identified in the convention. Did you get a chance to take a look at all, Farah, at the U.S. government report to see whether it touches on any of the issues that you're planning to work on?
Actually, we did, and the U.S. government report that was submitted in June 2013, I mean, it really shows that the U.S. continues to struggle with addressing violence against women and communities of color. So we're looking at statistics. We are looking specifically, and when we read the report and we reviewed it, what we saw, for example, it's in Section 187 of Article 6 on page 96 of the report. There's this progressive ideal of empowering communities to address issues, empowering communities themselves, communities of color, to address issues of violence with a necessary highlight, obviously, on sexual violence, and that's advocated. And the report states specifically the best response to violence against women, the response most likely to empower survivors and hold offenders accountable, is a response driven and defined by the community served. Yet, from a systemic vantage point, really the devices of institutional racism, racial profiling, police brutality, as I just mentioned before in referencing the 2008 observations, mass incarceration, poverty, all of these have created dynamics really that make it persistently difficult, if not dangerous, to address issues within communities, intra-community-wise. In addition to that, there aren't enough resources provided. So laws are passed, VAWA was passed, for example, and there aren't specific resources provided for communities or even the historically black colleges and universities to implement them, to really put the provisions and benefits of that into action. And so that's one thing that was really glaring for us. In addition to other things, we're continuing to comb through the report and pull out just really the key themes and the key issues that we want to highlight where the U.S. government can really do better in making sure that what they're saying, they put their money where their mouth is, basically, and that what they're saying, they're backing it up with resources to those communities that they say should be empowered to address the issues.
Great. And I know the U.S. government report is quite lengthy, and I think you mentioned that you did a find search, Control F search or whatever, to look for your keywords to identify, to zero in on where in the report. And I know that the U.S. Human Rights Network has done a summary of the report as well. Right. So for all of you thinking, oh, you have this daunting report to comb through, there are some tools at your disposal to help make that process a little bit less painful. Up on the screen, you'll also see reference to the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism and the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Those are two special procedures the UN has, and these special procedures sometimes do country visits and write reports on the United States, so you can also take a look at those reports to see if there's anything you want to draw on from what their conclusions were. So I know we're running short on time. Let's move ahead to step 5, and I think Farah already got a jump start on this topic, is clarifying your role, your organization's role, how you can help the committee. You can shed more light on the rights and related issues with on-the-ground information, first-hand accounts from victims, for example, or from people who are service providers, looking at published reports, drawing on other specialized knowledge or other information from a variety of sources. So And so you have a lot of expertise to share with the committee members about what's happening on the ground. And I like to see these reports not so much as shadow reports, but as flashlight reports, that you're shedding light on things that there's not enough light shed on them in the U.S. government's report. Sometimes they brush things under the rug. Sometimes they ignore things entirely. Sometimes they sugarcoat things. And you're there to really shed light on what's really happening so that committee members can see through whatever veneer there is that the U.S. government was trying to put on the rights issues that are implicated. So with that in mind, what sorts of, how do you see your role, Farah, as shedding more light on the issues?
We are in the process, in fact, of collecting testimony. So these testimonies are obviously not all going to be, put in the report and written out, but there are specific sentences and specific quotes by survivors that can really highlight for the committee where the United States is, and we need to keep a positive sort of our language positive, but where the United States is not really meeting its obligation. I don't want to say just blatantly failing, but not meeting its obligations, or where the United States can do better, and where they can and where we can support the process in terms of the United States doing better. We're also gathering information from advocates who are seeing this at a systemic level, where systems can do better. So we're going to use quotes. We're also using other reports by other organizations that are looking at the same issues. Reports that are viable, and really just flagging and proposing specific questions and recommendations, clarifying key local, national laws as well that impact the issue. So that's really how those are the tools that we're going to use to really shed more light on the situation on the ground. We're really going to humanize it and provide that information.
That's great. Now we'll move on to talking about setting goals. And Farah already talked about looking at the 2008 concluding observations from the committee and thinking about things that could be better the next time around in 2014. What do you as an organization want to see in the concluding observations, in the recommendations the committee makes to the United States government? And you can also think, and think more broadly, when that interactive dialogue comes up, as Gabriella referred to, that in-person review, what questions should the committee members be asking the U.S. government delegation in August 2014 when they get together in Geneva? What questions do you want the committee members to be voicing to the U.S. government to really hold the government accountable for what it said in its report and for what's happening on the ground? So those are things that you should think about as you decide what to include and what to exclude from the report, because as we heard from Gabriella, they want them to be short. So before you start writing, think about what's your end goal. What do you want the committee to say? What questions do you want them to ask, and what recommendations do you want them to make to the U.S. government? And then focus what you include in the report as supporting material for those questions and for those concluding observations. Have you given that any thought, Farah?
We've started to give it, well, we have given it some thought, and of course, it's going to require, just more meeting, talking, and really looking at the information, especially after the bulk of the report is completed. But we really want to reiterate, and we want to look at some of the concluding observations, and as I mentioned before, to really shift some of the focus and shift some of the language, because when you're looking at racism and you're looking at systemic racism, the way that we talk about perpetrators and prosecution and appropriately punishing, there's got to be other ways, and that really ties into what was mentioned in the U.S. report in terms of really putting the resources in the hands of community so that community can develop their own mechanisms as well for community accountability, for primary prevention, and that requires funding, and that requires resources, and that requires clarification and awareness raising around the specific legislation, not only at the community and grassroots level, but also at the, HBCU, historically Black college and university levels, which are, really under fire at the moment in terms of really making sure that they adhere to these laws that are not clear to them. So, we really need to think about how to articulate that. So we haven't really gotten to the point where we can say specifically, this is how we're going to articulate it, but we have very clear ideas in terms of what we do want to ask.
Great, great. And one thing that I think a lot of organizations will find with respect to their issues is there's a big gap between the law on the books and what's happening in practice on the ground. And you should think creatively in terms of what recommendations you'd like to see the committee make about what concretely could the committee recommend that would help bridge that gap between laws that may be strong on the books and gaps in practice. So that's a great thing to start thinking about. All right, let's move on to step 7. I wonder if we're having problems advancing the slides. Well, while we're getting the slides moving forward, there we go. We'll talk about, and I'll just go through the next 3 steps pretty quickly. We're talking about making and implementing a work plan. So you want to connect what your expertise is, what information you have access to, victim accounts or service provider accounts or other information, with what your end goals are, and start gathering information. Take a look at those sources. We heard from Gabriella, it's important that the sources be credible and relevant, and pull that information together. And as you're doing this, also plan ways to use the report beyond the UN review. You certainly, if you have an organizational website, will want to put the report up on the website. Maybe you want to use media advocacy as well to announce that you've submitted this report to raise visibility about your issues. Maybe you want to use it in public education. Use it with the stakeholders that you deal with as an advocacy tool as well. But the main point here is making and implementing that work plan. So now we'll move on to step 8, writing the report. And in writing the report, you'll want to set up a report writing team so that it doesn't fall on the shoulders of just one person. But you'll take the information that you gathered, and there is a template provided by the U.S. Human Rights Network. You may also want to review the United States Common Core document that gives sort of a general overview of the U.S. legal framework as it relates to all of its treaty obligations. And then in your report, be sure to incorporate proposed questions and recommendations, the ones you came up with in step 6. It's fine to recommend to the committee to offer suggested recommendations, suggested questions, with the exact language you'd like to see the committee using. Go ahead and suggest that sort of language so that so the committee knows exactly what you want. You don't need to beat around the bush. And one reminder is not to use abusive language. All of the UN bodies are pretty strict about that, so try to be neutral and objective in the way you present your information. Then you're going to, in step 9, finalize and submit your report. It's due to I think it's due to the U.S. Human Rights Network by June 30th. It's due to the committee 2 weeks before the review, but we heard from Gabriella they'd like to receive it well in advance. And optional, but highly recommended, is to get stakeholder input before you submit. So have other stakeholders read your report and offer suggestions for revisions, and recruit sign-ons. Get other organizations to sign on to the report. And that's a strength in numbers advantage, and it's also showing to the committee members that this isn't just one single shadow report. This is a shadow report that has the endorsement of a lot of different organizations around the United States. That shows the CERD committee that you've done your homework and that you're not just speaking as one organization. You're speaking, your report stands for the position of many organizations, and then they'll pay more attention to it. So that's step 9. And step 10 is advocating for your issue. If you have a chance to do advocacy with the committee in Geneva, you can do so in that way. And there's follow-up during the August process, during the in-person examination or interactive dialogue, meeting with committee members there and doing advocacy one-on-one and in the sessions that civil society will have with the committee for implementation and advocacy with the U.S. government for implementation of recommendations that have been accepted. And you can also think of the shadow report and the CERD review process as part of your long-term goals for social justice. So you can do additional advocacy with that report. Farah, have you thought a little bit about how you might use this report that you're working on with your longer-term social justice goals?
Absolutely. We are Black Women's Blueprint. We're the convener of the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission to focus on Black women in the U.S. and their experiences with sexual violence. And so we really want to use the report as a springboard to ramp up the work around the Truth Commission, and to, by the time we get to our tribunal in 2016, to really have that as have the report as a tool that we've been using between August, and then to educate community, to mobilize community, to inform community that an organization that we can say, although we're national, we consider ourselves, grassroots in many ways as far as our community-based, asset-based organizing in communities, that anyone can really participate in this process, and that this applies to each and every one of us. And really, we want to use any and all of the upcoming CERD committee recommendations to advocate at the community level. We want to use the report and the recommendation as an educational tool within the historically black colleges and universities and in the community, as well as around we want to use anything around the U.S. obligations. We want to educate around that and how this relates to women's conditions, gender violence, lack of access to justice, and how to organize for resources to address these and to ensure the work is done through education, mobilization, pressuring for new policy on the ground. So we are definitely going to be using that, the report and the CERD committee recommendations for long-term advocacy goals when VAWA comes up again, for reauthorization, for clarity around Title IX, that address issues of protecting victims of gender violence, and any other policy that comes out of that comes out of our survivor community.
Great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful, Farah. Well, thank you, Farah, for walking through these 10 steps with how you intend to use them with the Black Women's Blueprint and what your thoughts are in moving forward. And I hope it's a helpful illustration for all of you who are participating in the webinar and listening in to see how you can think through these issues and these steps for your group. It's not meant to be an intimidating process. You're really doing a great service to the committee by helping them understand the facts on the ground in the United States as they prepare to examine the U.S. delegation in August. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Salima.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Sorry.
Hi, Salima. Sorry, this is Adrian. I was just going to say a thank you to Amy and Farah for that fantastic walkthrough. So go ahead. And now we have Salima Hankins. Go ahead to talk about our process.
Hi, so I'm the coordinator for the CERD review process through the network. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about our process and the multiple ways in which you can be involved in the review process. And so as Amy and Farah mentioned, as well as Gabriella and Adam, one way to participate is through the shadow reporting process. Using the tools that Amy and Farah presented, you can reach out to allies to begin drafting shadow reports, and let them know if let us know if you're drafting shadow reports. So we're going to do our best to try to connect people who are working on similar issues, but you really know who your allies are, and these usually are people who you've been working with in the past. Definitely let us know, because we're compiling a list of organizations that are working on different reports, and we're going to try to post that on the website for folks. We also sent an email around yesterday, which contained core documents and other information that we think will be useful. So if you have not received that email, you can send me an email, and I will forward that information to you. My email address is actually on this PowerPoint that we'll be sharing with you as well. As Gabriella suggested, and the CERD committee wants us to, as much as possible, submit joint reports that are concise, so we think that the reports will have more weight if there are multiple organizations that are signing on. So if you're working on, for example, trafficking, even if you're looking at different aspects of that particular issue, you might want to work with someone who is also working on that issue, because and to try to create a joint report around that. As we mentioned before, the deadline is June 30th to get your submissions to us. We'll be drafting an executive summary of all of the reports, and then we will submit that to the committee. And so we'll have obviously a question and answer session after this, so that you can ask any questions that you might have about that process. The other way to get involved is through what we're calling the working groups, which are issue-based working groups. Let's see here, I have some sample working groups. So these are issue-based groups, and we're asking people to employ intersectional approach in looking at these groups that will analyze gender, gender identity, disability, and sexuality. And I have a couple of samples up here. One of them is a criminal justice system working group, a children's rights working group, a housing rights and segregation working group. And these groups are actually evolving depending on, so as people join the groups, we'll decide whether we need to combine some groups or break them up further. So we would really encourage you to join a working group, and in order to do that, you can also send me an email and tell me of your interest. And then the purpose of the working groups are actually threefold. The first is to organize the shadow reporting process, as we mentioned before. And then the second is advocacy in Geneva. So each working group, we hope, will have about 2 minutes to present to the committee on their issue. And so it will be important for these groups that are working on the same issues to work together, because the presentation has to be very concise. And you also want to be able to refer back to these working groups so that even people who are not in Geneva can participate by helping to answer any questions or providing follow-up information. And then the last way that these working groups will be useful is for advocacy at home. We want these groups to be involved in implementation, including work with the Equality Working Group, and as part of the Human Rights at Home campaign. And this will include engaging grassroots organizations, planning regional human rights hearings, and we are actually planning a National Day of Action on July 2nd, so definitely look out for information on that. It's going to include a Twitter rally, and we'll encourage groups to plan other activities locally in commemoration of the anniversary of the Civil Rights Act as well. We have a list here of helpful resources for folks who are writing shadow reports, as well as those who are joining working groups who just want more information about the process. We have the core documents that include the U.S. government report, the 2008 concluding observations, as well as, frequently asked questions, and then the suggested shadow report template. The suggested length that we are suggesting is actually 3 to 4 pages for these shadow reports. So we're hoping that people can be thorough but also concise. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything else. Yeah, so I think that that's all the information I wanted to convey. As I said, we have all of this information is available on the website as well. We are going to open it up for questions right now. And regarding the question and answer session,
all attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
So the way that we're going to do this is we are going to, at the top of your screen where it says My Mood, what you can do is go there and then click it, and then it will allow you to raise your hand. At that point, you can raise your hand, and then we can call on you, and at that point, you have the ability to unmute yourself. So if you are using the audio through your computer, it should be relatively easy for you to mute and unmute yourself. If you're using the audio through your telephone, what you can do is press *6 to unmute yourself. And the issue is that you can't then go back and mute yourself, so we're going to ask you to use the functionality on your phone to actually mute it that way. So we'll go to questions. And as I said, just go to My Mood and raise your hand.
So we have some questions that are coming in through the chat. So I'm going to read the first question that that I see here, which is J.R. Fleming is asking, what is the preferred format for video submissions? One-on-one interviews. He's asking if one-on-one interviews is the preferred format. Should we show homeless sleeping on the street in comparison to a high-end development, closed public housing structures or vacant buildings side by side? And I would say in response to that question that we will need to get more information on the preferred format. We are encouraging people to take videos, and we're hoping that we can find a way to send them to committee members ahead of time. But during the formal or informal briefing itself, there is no space, if you will, for showing videos. However, like we said, perhaps during a side event or prior to the review, we can send those videos to the committee members. But we will need to find out for them what they think what they would suggest in terms of preferred format. What I can say though is that the shorter, the more focused, the better. And that, yes, if you can use video to demonstrate clear need and contradictions, if you will, in the use of resources in the U.S., that would be very helpful as well. Now, and I'm pausing in case any of the other presenters have any additional comments on that question before we move on. Okay, and I also see some hands raised now. There's a question, before I go to the first raised hand, there's a question also asking if the chat will remain available for reference after the call ends. We are recording the call, so it should be available after the call ends that we'll share. And so next we have Julia Perez, whose hand is raised. Julia, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6.
Thank you. Did you want me to read my question?
Julia. Oh, yes, please. If it's the same question, then read it for people who may not be on the computer.
Okay. I was wondering, given that there's various organizations all working on shadow reports, how and when will it be decided who will attend Geneva to advocate in person?
All right, great question. So the truth is that, in theory, anybody can go to Geneva to advocate in person. In practice, we're limited by our purses, so resources, in essence. So we at the network, the U.S. Human Rights Networks Coordinating Center, have been looking for some resources to make some travel scholarships available, and we will be making the announcements about the travel scholarships, if not by the end of this week, then early next week. But those are very limited resources, and people have to apply, and we prioritize giving scholarships to people who are directly impacted by the issues they're advocating on. But other than that, and maybe looking for other resources to help fund travel to Geneva, anyone can attend the meeting in Geneva. You just have to register ahead of time. And we'll be circulating information about registration at a later point.
Thank you. And one slightly related question. Will there be any other reports presented at that time outside of your network? For example, would somebody else be presenting their report who didn't coordinate with you?
Yes, so people can submit reports on their own, and people can submit reports through the network. So the network is trying to coordinate the process and make sure that groups are in touch with each other and that we don't have as much duplication as we have tended to have in the past. However, yes, groups are free to submit reports directly to the committee. And we'll be circulating information on how groups can do that as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so the next person I see here is Melanie Hilbrandt. And you can unmute yourself, I think, on the computer.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, actually some of the other questions already, or question askers already got to my question, but the one small one that remains is, could I hear please a repeat of the step 6 from Amy and Farah's piece on how to write the shadow report? I was taking notes, but I think I missed a few things. Step 6.
All right, Amy and
Yeah.
Farah?
Sure, we can quickly go over. Step 6 is about setting goals for the review, thinking about what you want the members of the CERD committee to say on your behalf about the issues that you care about. So, for example, what questions should they be asking the U.S. government delegation? If there's some things in the U.S. government's report that aren't entirely accurate or brush things under the rug, you can formulate questions for the committee members to ask to the government, and so that's something to think about in terms of setting your goals. And then take a look at what recommendations you'd like the committee to make to the U.S. government. So it's all about, step 6 is about goal setting, about what you want the committee to say and do through the review, so that then you can take those responses or take those recommendations and use them to bolster your advocacy work on the ground.
Great.
I don't know, Farah, do you have anything to add?
Oh, that's it. That's exactly it. So reviewing those and really looking at our issue, the goal that we'd like the goal that we've set, for ourselves, and based on those, the previous observations, previous recommendations, really ask for what we need and what would really help us push our issue forward and do some long-term advocacy.
Wonderful.
And I'll just add that thinking about those goals is a good way to sort of narrow down what you're going to talk about in your report, because you put what's in the report, put in your shadow report what's necessary to support your argument in favor of those particular outcomes you're shooting for. So you don't have to cover everything. Cover the things that are most relevant to what you hope the committee to issue in its concluding observations and to ask questions about.
Right.
All right, thank you so much. And so next we have I'll just respond to a quick question on chat, which is asking whether the slides will be available after this. And yes, we can make the slides available after the webinar. So the next question is from Stephanie Franklin. Stephanie, you can unmute yourself on your computer. Okay, so while we're waiting for Stephanie, she might be having problems unmuting herself. I will respond to another question that came up or I will read out another question that came up on the chat. And that is, how could college students get involved? To write a shadow report, do you have to be part of a working group? No, do you have to be part of an organization? And if you do have to be working with an organization, does the decision to write a shadow report have to be led by the leaders of the organization, or could members lead the project? I'll give a quick response, and then if any of the other presenters also want to respond, please do. But I'll answer the latter question first, which is that you do not have to be part of an organization to write a shadow report. But obviously, it's important that people writing shadow reports are connected with groups that are working on the issue and are directly impacted by the issues that they're reporting on. and that you connect with other groups that are interested in submitting reports on the same issue. We have asked people to follow up with Salima Hankins to let us know what reports that topics you're planning to cover in your shadow reports. That way we can help link you with other groups that are writing on a similar report. So I would say a first step would be that we would suggest would be to write Salima to let her know what topic you're writing on, to see if someone else is already covering the topic, and that way you can connect with them. But individuals can write shadow reports. And then college students, there's so many different ways in which college students can be supportive. In the past, college students have been really instrumental in helping draft the reports and conduct some background research for the reports. College students can be very helpful in raising awareness about the review, upcoming review, and engaging and planning for the National Day of Action that Salima mentioned that happens on July 2nd. So there are a number of ways, and we can follow up some more offline on how college students can get involved. And we'll be talking at the end of this call on some of the next steps that we have, which are also opportunities for college students to get involved. Are there do any of the other presenters have any other comments, particularly on that question of how to engage the college students?
This is Amy Berquist at the Advocacy for Human Rights. I would encourage, if you're a college student and you don't have a specific connection to an organization, but you're interested in getting involved on a particular issue, try to identify what are the organizations in the United States that are working on that issue and contact them and offer your services to say, hey, have you heard about this opportunity to engage with the United Nations on your issues? I've attended a training about this. I would really love to help draft a report and work with you on bringing these issues to the United Nations, bringing them to Geneva as a different way to help support your advocacy. And so that's a great way to get involved and help support an organization that might not otherwise have heard of this review or might not otherwise have its own capacity to do a shadow report. That might be another way for college students to get involved.
Right, and this is Farah from Black Women's Blueprint with the Historically Black Colleges and Universities. What we're doing is we're really making sure, as Amy says, to let the college students know that this is happening, that they can initiate. I think they can initiate their own reports and connect with the U.S. Human Rights Network or connect with us. Black Women's Blueprints to include their issues if it's an issue that ties into or that is with our own goals, so that we can include that in our report.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, I think Stephanie is unmuted. Stephanie, are you able to ask your question? All right, so we'll go to the next person who has her hand up, and that's Vicky Casanova-Willis. You can mute yourself on your computer, or if you're calling from the phone, press *6.
Hi, it's Vicky.
Hi, Vicky.
Hi. Thank you all so much for this walkthrough and this feedback. I actually did not have a question so much as I was just trying to make sure that I shared that information, specifically after the question from the college student about how to get engaged. It occurred to me that for the folks on the call here, to know that at least from a standpoint here in Chicago and trying to help coordinate and engage some of the community-based members, who have not yet been engaged in the CERD process, but who are interested in doing so. At this point, there are specifically some members in the African American community who are trying to raise issues and become very involved, and we just want to help ensure that we're unifying those voices. And so I don't have a question with regard to that, but I wanted to make sure that you all were aware of it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Vicki.
Absolutely.
Was someone else saying something? Okay. Stephanie, it's showing me that you are on, and you can unmute yourself by pressing *6.
Can you hear me now, Ajim?
Oh, yes, we can.
Ajim?
Wonderful. Go.
Okay.
Yes.
I've been trying to get through. How are you?
We're good.
And so I want to thank everyone on the panel. Thank you so much. This is a great presentation. I just had a few questions. So just for clarification, Salima mentioned that the U.S. Human Rights Network will be writing the executive order. So is that for all of the shadow reports, or is it one shadow report? I just need to be clear on the technical aspects of how this will be done.
Okay. So to that question, we'll say that, yes, we're drafting, the network will be drafting an executive summary of all the reports that are submitted to us by June 30th. And we will be submitting and we will be translating that executive summary into Spanish and French to submit to the CERD, to the committee members.
Okay, so we don't have to worry about that, the ones who are submitting the report.
Yes, no, you don't have to worry about that. In addition, Gabriella had mentioned for people who are submitting shadow reports, especially if they don't plan to submit it through the network, you might also think about including in your individual shadow reports a one-pager executive summary summarizing the main points of the shadow report. But like we said, we're really encouraging people to write short reports. So if you are successful in writing a short report, you may not end up needing that executive summary. And by short, we're saying 3 to 4 pages.
3 to 4 pages. So this is a question, too, for the working groups that you have, Ajim. Are each of those going to be separate shadow reports, or are each of those identified issues that will be submitted in one shadow report?
So the working groups, and there were a few other questions about the working groups on the chat. We sent around an email identifying some of the initial working groups that we had come up with in the CERD task force. Now also, like Salima mentioned, those are not set in stone. As people start to engage with the working groups, they may realize that that the groupings don't make as much sense as we initially thought. So there might be some revisions as we move forward. You do not have to, how do we say this without being confusing? You do not have to submit a shadow report to be part of the working group, and you actually don't have to be part of the working group to submit a shadow report. We've created the working groups to help coordinate and organize the process so that, let's say, 3 different groups submit shadow reports on criminal justice. We would hope that they all participate in a working group so that they can coordinate with each other and have a coordinated joint strategy for advocating with the committee, so that the committee members are not hearing from several different people on the same issue, which eats into their time, and we don't view as the most effective use of the lobbying. So the working groups are really created to help all groups that are interested in the process to coordinate with each other around issue areas.
Okay, and so if, say, there are several of us that are working together and we want to submit a shadow report on our particular issue, will it, are you suggesting that each individual person submit a 3 to 4 page document to be included in one shadow report, or is the entire shadow report of those 3 people that may be working in a working group together, should the total be 3 to 4 pages?
The latter. So we're suggesting the latter. Now, this is an ideal, right?
Right.
But we really do think it's important for people to try to be focused and concise and brief. So yes, we're encouraging people when they submit joint reports to make those reports short and brief, and we're suggesting 3 to 4 pages. However, if people go a couple pages over, that's fine. It's just that we really want to encourage people to be to the point and brief.
Okay. Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome, Stephanie. So I don't see any other hands raised at the moment, but I want to see if there are any questions from the chat. There are a couple questions from the chat asking if people have working groups, if there are people working on shadow reports in different parts of the country. If you could direct those questions to Salima Hankins. And let me just make sure I have her information up. So we have her information up on the screen, her email address. That way she can respond to you directly, because part of what we're trying to do is to make sure that people who have already contacted us are in contact with other people. So to everyone on the call, if you're also planning on writing a shadow report and know the topic, please send that information as soon as you can to Salima Hankins. In addition, there's a question about a group that may not have the capacity to prepare a shadow report. Oh, but they're working with others on the issue. So all this information we will again make sure that Salima has, so that she's connecting you with anyone else that we know working on similar issues or in your area. Bear with me while I try to read the rest of the questions that we see on the chat. So there's another question about whether the slides can be emailed, and yes, we can email the slides. And then there's another question about whether people need special credentials to get into the building at the UN. For the reviews, you just need to register ahead of time. And what we would suggest, as you see on the screen, is that you join the CERD listserv, and we will share that with all the participants of this call right afterwards, because if you join the CERD listserv, you will get the information for how you can register for the review itself when that time comes up. But you don't need to have, for example, special consultative status with the United Nations in order to attend the review. Anyone can register to attend the review. So maybe we should move to the next steps, since I don't see any other questions or hands raised. Salima, do you want me to go through these?
Yeah, I think that might be helpful. They're pretty.
Okay.
I think you kind of mentioned to contact me for the second and a third bullet point, and also to join the listserv. So.
Okay, wonderful. And then we wanted to bring to everyone's attention that the network, the U.S. Human Rights Network, is having our quarterly member call on June 19th. I believe the time for that is actually from 5 to 6:30 p.m. We will make sure to share that information with you in the email we send to all the participants after this call. But again, mark the date for June 19th from 5 to 6:30 p.m. Again, to join a working group, please email Salima Hankins, and we will be recirculating the list, the working group list at the end of this week. And again, if you have thoughts about why some working group might be better, if you have comments on how we might reshape working groups, let us know. We'll try our best to accommodate the needs, bearing in mind that we are also trying to be very focused and to create working groups that makes sense for advocacy, but also for effective use of the time we have with the committee, as well as beyond. If you're interested in writing a shadow report, or you're already or contributing to a shadow report, or you are already writing or contributing to one, please let Salima know so that she can connect you with other groups. We will also be posting that information on our website so that you can connect with people on your own. And again, the deadline for submitting those reports to us, and the suggested deadline also for the UN is June 30th. Now, as was mentioned earlier, typically the CERD committee does not require people to submit reports until 2 weeks before the session. But because they understand how large the U.S. is and they're expecting a large volume of reports from the U.S., they are encouraging us to submit those reports well in advance. And so that's why we are sticking to this June 30th date. That makes it more likely that the committee members will be able to read and absorb the information that we share with them. Again, if you're not on the CERD listserv, please join the CERD listserv. This is the most effective way of ensuring that you get up-to-date information on what the task force is, CERD task force is planning, and also whatever information we get or that others on the listserv get that are related to the CERD review and beyond. And then finally, we're encouraging everyone to join the U.S. Human Rights Network as a member. And to join as a member, you can, we will send you the link. You can do so online from this PowerPoint. I think that you can also click on this link. It's a live link that you can click on to join the network as a dues-paying member and help support this kind of work that we are doing to ensure that as many groups as possible are engaging in this process effectively, and that we are building a strong people-centered human rights movement in the U.S. And then finally, we just wanted to share with you some links, some of the ones I mentioned, which include the CERD listserv, obviously the network's website, our project page for CERD, which we will be sharing right after this webinar, Salima Hankin's email address, and then the actual link for joining to become a member. So, as indicated earlier, we had scheduled this to be a 2-hour call, but we were hoping to end in an hour and a half, and we are on schedule. So I'd just like to end by saying a huge thank you to our wonderful panelists, our presenters, and to all of you for joining the call and for the very important questions that you've asked. We will be following up with resources, as we mentioned earlier. And if you have any other questions, feel free to contact us, contact Salima, or any of the presenters as well. We can make sure that you connect with them either directly or through us. And with that, I say have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.